My next guest made waves when he released a campaign video calling for term limits and age limits for politicians in his state of South Carolina.
Our country and our state are being run by a geriatric oligarchy. People who stay in office way past their prime. The folks who are making a career out of politics are making a mess of our country. That's why it's time to put term limits and age limits on politicians. It'll bring new blood and new ideas to the table.
Here with me to discuss is former Democratic Congressman Joe Cunningham, who's running for governor in South Carolina. You know, Congressman, people look at this and they say, well, we already have age limits. We already have term limits. They come every 2, 4, or 6 years. If the voters want to vote you out, they can vote you out.
Well, we all know that's a fallacy, though, Michael. I mean, look what politicians have done. Across the country, they've drawn their lines to pick their voters. So they've engaged in gerrymandering where I think there's like 435 congressional seats, and only about 2 to 3 dozen of those are actually competitive. And everyone knows how difficult it is to beat an incumbent, and they have the power of the incumbency. So whenever you pick your own voters and you have the power of the incumbency, there aren't actual real competitive races. So I think everyone knows that that's simply just not true.
I thought what was compelling in your commercial was when you made reference to other professions. Catherine, roll that video and we'll respond.
Airline pilots are forced to retire at age 65. Federal law enforcement officers, 57. Judges here in South Carolina, 72.
What?
Have you ever noticed that politicians hardly ever retire?
I mean, it makes a good point that at this point, I'm 3 years beyond being a federal investigator by your definition of this. So what has been the reaction? Because I think this was politically risky for you to take on.
Look, I'm saying the quiet parts out loud, Michael. I'm saying what others are thinking, and the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, take for instance here in South Carolina, where I mentioned that 72 is the retirement age for judges. You know, if 72 is too old to interpret the law, why is it not too old to make the law? And the fact is, in South Carolina, we have the oldest governor in our state's history, Governor McMaster, who's 75 years old. And he's been in politics. He's been a politician, get this, longer than I've been alive, literally. And you look at where it's gotten us. You know, we're dead last in roads. We're near the bottom with teacher pay, with health care. Every metric of the quality of life, we're at or near the bottom. And he's been in politics for over 4 decades. So that, I mean, he's teaching a master class in age limits.
I don't deny that it's on people's mind, but on the question of whether it's smart politics, the whole country recalls the role that Jim Clyburn played for Joe Biden in the last presidential nomination process when Congressman Clyburn was asked about you and this issue. This is a very short clip, but here was his response.
Joe needs to grow up.
He says you need to grow up. You say what?
Look, I don't expect those who would be impacted by this policy to come running towards it with open arms. And, you know, the question is
he's 82.
Can these people, yeah, and the question is not, I have a lot of respect for the whip. And, you know, I worked well with him in Congress. And the question is not, can these people do the job, but it's should they do the job? And right now, you know, we have a decline in voter turnout, specifically among younger people. And you think about who could blame these kids for not showing up at the polls when they have to choose between two 70-year-olds or 80-year-olds for the President of the United States. What do they have in common with these people in their 70s and 80s? They breathe air?
So
that's
from
about it. You know,
Harrop, I think that's the pronunciation, writing in the Courier, says she hopes you win, quote, but playing the age card is simply not great politics. For starters, there are a lot of 72-year-old voters. Have you just written off a part of the electorate, or do you think that a certain number of seniors themselves recognize what you're saying?
I see some of the greatest support from seniors. And you know what they tell me, Michael? They tell me, like, you know, we've had our opportunity in government, and it's time for a new generation. And this is what it's all about. This is not about disparaging or saying that these people in their, you know, in their older years cannot do the job. This is about making room for a new generation of leadership. Because when you look at Washington, D.C., or you look at Columbia, South Carolina, You see people in their 70s and 80s. This is about having people make the decisions who are going to be around long enough to live with the actual consequences. All right, because I'm looking out for my 4-year-old son. We're looking.
I would be
Go ahead,
derelict in my duty if I didn't point out that this whole subject applies to the current president of the United States, as well as the past president of the United States, as I just noted. But what you're saying has direct relevance to Joe Biden. Your thought?
Yeah. Well, look, I think, you know, what people hate about politics is the hypocrisy. And that's why weeks ago I said that President Biden should not run for another term. And I won't support his run for another term because I think it's time for a new generation of leadership. And this is nothing personal against the president, but this is about being consistent. And people hate politics because they'll call out something in another party, but won't have the guts to call it out within their own party. I'm over here calling balls and strikes, and that's what I'm doing. And I think that's new for politics, and I think it's refreshing for voters to hear.
The only part of the commercial I didn't like was the fixing of the router, because I'm constantly doing that for my mother, and my kids are still doing it for me. Joe Cunningham, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.